Hi, everyone. Welcome to 19V. I'm Sarah Dickinson, and I am part of the triad, along with Anne Lounsbury and Margaret Shamu, that organizes these seminars. We are, as always, very grateful to NYU's Jordan Center for providing a platform for our meetings, both on Zoom and in recorded form on YouTube, and also to the Jordan Center staff, especially Sasha Spitalnik, who's not here tonight. We have with us instead Verena Podolskaya and Lana Bielinkaya, and we're very grateful to them for their help with publicity and technical support. So tonight, this is our last talk for the academic year. This is our 5th year of existence, so yay, 19V. And our speaker tonight is Katharina Wiedlack from the University of Vienna, a little different, who will be speaking on Nancy Prince, a Black American working class woman among the Russian nobility. And as sobesiednik today, for some of us, we have our very own Anne Lounsbury from NYU. So without further ado, I give the floor to Katharina.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind invitation, Sarah and Anne, and for allowing me to speak here. As Sarah said, I'm from the University of Vienna, and I'm an Americanist. So my approach really comes from American studies. So for any input that comes from your Russian studies perspective, I'm so grateful. All right, let me share my presentation quickly. All right, can everybody see it? Yes, good. All right, so in the next 40 minutes or so, I will offer some insights from my close reading of a narrative of the life and travels of Mrs. Nancy Prince, written by herself. I will focus on Nancy Prince's experience in Russia, contextualize them, and speculate about the effects these experiences had on her further life and thinking. The autobiography or memoir was first published by herself in 1850 and then subsequently republished in edited versions in 1853 and 1856. It offers carefully selected details of Nancy Prince's life. For example, that she was born as a free woman in Massachusetts in 1799, that her family suffered from great economic hardship, which forced her to start working as a servant already as a preteen. She also talks about her stepfather and brother being seamen, and that her sister was coerced into sex work. She also describes or tells us that she married a Mr. Prince, and that she traveled with him to Russia in 1824, where she stayed for 9 years before returning to the US. The memoir ends with her work in Jamaica and about Jamaica, and her US work and her work in the US on behalf of the Black community, especially in abolitionist circles. This image here is from the Boston Women's Heritage Trail website, and the website suggests that this is Nancy Prince, but the site does not really offer any further information where the image comes from, and so I'm a little bit skeptical about if it's really Nancy Prince, especially because of the fashion. But yeah, that's what the website says, and the image is shown in relation to the African Meeting House in Boston's Beacon Hill district, which is a part where Nancy Prince really frequented, or where she often spoke to the community. And the museum and the website are part of the American History Museum. Prince's autobiography is exceptional in itself. It is the only known narrative by a Black American woman about her travels to and extended stay in Russia during the first half of the 19th century, at least to my knowledge. I couldn't find any other of such narratives. By conducting a literary analysis of Prince's narrative and by contextualizing her findings within the respective racial and gendered historical national discourses of the US and of Russia, I aim to show how Prince shaped her positionality as a free Black working woman through her Russian encounters. I argue that Prince's extended stay in Russia significantly informed her ideas around American national belonging as a Black person and her perspective on social change. The way Prince tells her narrative can be understood as a strategy of writing herself into a position of authority. The forces that she had to write against were manifold and connected to her race and gender. Born in Massachusetts, she was legally considered a free citizen according to state law. Massachusetts had abolished slavery by 1783 through judicial decisions, and I quote, guaranteed full civil and political rights, privileges, and immunity to the freed as subject of the state. However, racial discrimination was frequent, and Black Americans were often denied their civil rights, even in free states like Massachusetts. And so voting and equal access to public services was often denied. And moreover, on the federal level, her status was very unclear. So Prince's race and gender disadvantaged her in legal and social areas. Yet her narrative presents her as a woman with unusual self-determination and agency. On the surface, the travel narrative seems to follow the usual 19th century women's life writing. This means it focuses on personal thoughts, on personal relationships, and personal interactions. Yet already the start of her narrative has a kind of a special tone that I would argue is different from other female travel writings, especially because most other female travel writings were written by affluent white women. So Prince clarifies at the first pages that she is of Native American and African descent. And the language that she uses to describe her heritage is very close to the language that abolitionists used at the time and shows notions of Black and Indigenous consciousness. So she clarifies that her grandfather on her mother's side, as well as her stepfather, had been stolen from Africa and been brought to America, and that her grandmother was an Indian of this country and became a captive to the English or their descendants. Prince's narrative wants to appear innocent, yet although it is personal and introspective, both the language and each detail that she reveals seem to have a political purpose. Her language often shows a closeness to the writing, and I've already indicated that, two famous abolitionists, and one of them, the most famous probably, is Frederick Douglass, who published his memoir about his enslavement and fight for freedom only a few years before Nancy Prince did so. And we can assume that Nancy Prince read Frederick Douglass's publication. So by clarifying her heritage and using abolitionist language, Prince marks her identity as a Black identity, without explicitly mentioning factors of race or color for herself. And in the same breath, she denounces slavery through this language. Right. And in this vein, I also read little anecdotes that she uses to kind of like make her heritage a little bit more colorful or understandable. So she explains, for example, that her grandfather often used to tell us when little children the evils of slavery and how he was stolen from his native land. End of quote. In the few sentences she describes her family tree, she further emphasizes that her grandfather, although a slave, fought for liberty in the Revolutionary Army and at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So recounting this detail, she makes a strong claim to US national belonging and citizenship, positioning herself within the history of of American independence. And so positioning herself and her family really at the emergence of the US nation as such. And by mentioning her Native American grandmother, her claim seems to surpass even the founding fathers and the beginning of the US nation. So the seemingly random details about Prince's early years, as well as about her grandfather, parents, stepfather, siblings, and so forth, in my view, are carefully selected and are primarily chosen for their ethical value and political effect on the reader. When Prince remembers how his sister was driven into sex work by poverty and deceit, Prince has the chance to highlight her own bravery and unwavering character that does not judge her sister, but deeply cares for her well-being. When she mentions her young brother's decision to become a sailor, like their male relatives had been, she marks the importance for mobility and the importance that mobility plays for Black survival. And mobility is a strong topic throughout the whole narrative. And it also concerns herself because she had to be mobile early on to work in different families in surrounding areas. Yeah, she basically always went there where there was work because she had to support her mother and siblings. Despite her great efforts to financially and emotionally care for her mother and have siblings, they became wards of Gloucester, one of the towns where she lived. And that is one of the early problems of her life. Curiously, Prince does not say much about, and although she gives a lot of detail of her family, very selective ones, but still, Prince does not say much about her husband, Nero Prince, nor their marriage, aside from the fact that it brought her to Russia. She never even mentions Mr. Prince's name, his first name, but always refers to him as Mr. Prince. And I read these omissions as a narrative strategy to show Prince's personal growth as an agent for her of her own fate and a full citizen. Rather than focusing on the story of her meeting, engagement, and young marriage to Nero Prince, we know that it was Nero Prince by now, thanks to historians, although she never says so. So rather than focusing on the details of the relationship, Nancy Prince tells the reader that after she had taken care of her family's well-being as much as she could, she, I quote, I went to learn a trade, and after 7 years of anxiety and toil, I made up my mind to leave my country. So the emphasis here is on her decision and the act of leaving the USA to travel overseas, and not on the fact that she married and through marriage was taken abroad. And so then she continues to enumerate the facts in details, which is that on September 1st, 1823, Mr. Prince arrived from Russia. February 15th, 1824, we were married. And then on April 14th, we embarked on board the Romulus, bound for Russia. Prince neither reveals her husband's first name nor his birth date or any detail about their marriage. She briefly mentions that he visited at my mother's, but it is very unclear if they knew each other before or what the purpose of the visit was. She also omits that she was already the second wife of Nero princes. These omissions are, as I already indicated, narratological choices to steer the female narrative into a direction that emphasizes mobility and agency rather than romance, friendship, and adventure, which would be more usual or common foci of female travel writing. The omission about her husband are even more striking, considering that Nero Prince seems to have been a quite important political figure of the time. Historians think he was one of the organizers of the 1791 African Grand Lodge of Masons, of which he became Grand Master in 1808. If this is true, Nero Prince must have been significantly older than Nancy, and in any case of significantly higher standing than her. Prince mentions on many occasions that she came from extreme poverty. Interestingly, she explains her strong religious beliefs in conjunction with the hardship that she had to suffer through in early life. As a lower African-American working class woman. In his introduction to a new edition of Prince's narrative, Ronald G. Walters suggests that Prince's Protestantism, her religious belief, although it sounds very, very similar to what he called white belief, could also be read as a kind of a racial consciousness that she did not care to reveal in her narrative, or that she strategically maybe omitted. He emphasizes that the Reverend Thomas Paul, who baptized Nancy Prince and whom she mentions in her narrative, was a leader among Boston's free Black people or free Black society. And he was also active in the same Masonic lodge that her husband was part of. And he was a founder of very important institutions serving African Americans. So we can assume that he was a kind of a mentor for Nancy, but it's very curious that she doesn't really, talk much about this fact. Prince's omission of all the powerful men in her life seems motivated by her desire to appear resilient, brave, and self-sufficient. For the sake of her narrative and explaining not so much her mobility, but the rather unusual destination of Russia, she had to mention, though, that in Russia, Nero Prince became a servant to one of the noble ladies of the court at first, and then later footman to the Tsar himself. Out of curiosity, I tried to find out who the princess was that Nancy Prince mentions, and she calls her Pursotov. I hope you can read that in the script that I show here on the slide. I think the only person that has a similarly sounding name would be the Countess Hedwiga Pontusovna Armfeld. So this kind of like middle name, Pontusovna, could be with some fantasy, Pursotov. This countess lived at the same time in Russia that Nero Prince came there as a younger man, and so this could be a possibility. But I'm not claiming that it is absolutely historically correct. All right, so, and she was a Swedish countess who was exiled in Sweden, from Sweden to Russia, and was part of the Russian court at the time that Nero Prince came there. In any case, On this next slide here, I wanted to offer you a painting of the interior of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. And this painting is from 1865, which is some 30 years later or after Prince had already left the country. But what is interesting in this painting is that it shows one of the Black servants that served the court. I tried to enhance him a little bit. It's probably very blurry on your end. It is also on my end. But I took this picture. I wanted to show this picture because it shows that Black servants were just a part of the Russian court before and after Nancy Prince lived there, and it kind of like supports her narrative because she explains in her narrative that that there was a set number of, and she calls them colored men, that filled the station, and it was 20, and so forth. And she describes what they had to do as servants of the court. And this very much is supported by paintings, but also by historic analysis. Yes, so what is interesting is that in contrast to her fragmented and largely omitted description of her upward mobility and integration into Boston's Black religious and political elite society through marriage, the detailed and lush description of the events following her arrival in St. Petersburg are curious and seem to adhere to much more to the sentimental and materialistic romanticism popular at the beginning of the 19th century. She recalls in relative detail how the newlyweds were asked to attend an event on their behalf at the royal court, where they were greeted by the Emperor Alexander and Empress Elizabeth, and how the royal couple presented the princess the princess couple with a watch and other items, and I quote, "as it was customary in those days when anyone married belonging to the court," end of quote. But rather than suggesting that Prince decided midway through her narrative to fall into narrative conventions, I want to argue again that there is a surplus or even primary value in telling the reader all of these long descriptions, because by not simply mentioning, but rather like showing in detail how well she was treated, Prince really drives home the point that there was no prejudice against color, that they're all castes and the people of all nations, each in their place. So she kind of makes this point or supports this point that that there are societies, or there were societies, where anti-Black racism and chattel slavery were not prominent, or even claiming that Russian society was a society completely without anti-Black racism. So while the mere fact that residing as a valued part of the court, that she was residing as a valued part of the court would already have served her point, she reiterates that she experienced a complete absence of racial prejudice among the Russian elite. So thus, through her mobility, Prince becomes an eyewitness to the unnaturalness of chattel slavery and anti-Black racism in the US, by seeing a society that can do without. In Russia, Prince managed to establish herself as a member of the court and as a businesswoman. She claims to have learned the Russian language within 6 months, and even, I quote, made some proficiency in the French, which at the time was the language of the court. Already 3 weeks after moving into her new home, she opened a boarding house for several children and increased their numbers as time passed. Additionally, she successfully established a garment business, producing clothing for infants and small children of the St. Petersburg elite. I quote, "The baby linen making and children's garments were in great demand," she recalls. "I started a business in these articles and took a journeywoman and apprentices. The present empress gave me much encouragement by purchasing of me garments for herself and children, handsomely wrought in French and English styles, and many of the nobility also followed her example." End of quote. So Prince seems to be enchanted with the Russian nobility, presumably because they held her in high regards. And not thought of her as a servant or help, but as a productive member of their society. In addition to the positive report about her time in Russia, Prince writes about some crises that shook St. Petersburg during the historic period while she and her husband resided in Russia. So, for example, St. Petersburg was severely damaged by a flood already in 1824, so briefly after she arrived. And this flood killed many people, and she describes a very dramatic episode where she was almost drowning, but then could save herself by her own strength. Then a year later, when Tsar Alexander died in late 1825, there was, of course, the Decembrist uprising and this attempt of a revolution that was really brutally crushed by military loyal to the regime. And just to give you an impression of the Decembrist revolution and the counterinsurgency that happened, I put this image here. Of course, it's from much, much later. It was produced between 1972 and 1973. But I think it gives a little bit of an impression how it must have looked. And Nancy Prince describes in relative detail how the revolution was crushed. She writes, "The bodies of the killed and mangled were cast into the river, and the snow and ice were stained with the blood of human victims. As they were obliged to drive the cannon to and fro in the midst of the crowd, the bones of those wounded who might have been cured were crushed. The cannons are very large, drawn by 8 horses, trained for the purpose. The scene was awful." So she gives a very detailed impression. But interestingly, she takes herself out of the description and focuses only on the scene as a kind of eyewitness. And she seems to have been completely untouched by the political and social chaos of the time, or at least if she was not, she does not reveal that. Further on in the narrative, Prince describes and explains Russian religious and cultural customs of the Russian elite. For example, how the empress received visitors and how she dined together with female members of the elite, but also with prisoners of war. While doing this, while explaining that, she also mentions the topic of Russian serfdom, but only very briefly. She describes, for example, the village houses are built of logs corked with oakum, where the peasants reside. This class of people till the land. Most of them are slaves and are very degraded. The rich own the poor, but they are not suffered to separate families or sell them off the soil. All are subject to the emperor, and no nobleman can leave without his permission. So she likens serfdom or equates serfdom somehow with slavery, but she also marks the strong contrast to US chattel slavery. She emphasizes that serfdom does not mean the separation of families or the removal of people from their homes, which she and abolitionists, of course, identify as one of the cruel aspects of chattel slavery in the US South. And so with this brevity, she dismisses Russian serfdom as not worth going much into. And this is interesting because she talks a lot about US slavery, right? Especially then when she comes to Jamaica and when she enters the abolitionist societies in the US. And yet here in Russia, she kind of like mitigates in a way serfdom, although making those connections. So arguably, by dismissing serfdom, and also by the way she dismisses the cruelty of the Tsarist regime, or by not going into a full-on criticism of the Tsarist regime and brutality, she kind of like distances herself from Russian society and is this kind of like neutral onlooker. And I argue that speaks to her growing awareness that she is an American citizen and that she belongs to the US, although she feels very well and very integrated in Russian society, but she never attempts to become really full part of Russian society, and she definitely doesn't see herself as a Russian citizen. Her description of Russian society and how she is integrated and treated are more to emphasize the points where US society is wrong, where she was mistreated in US society, to kind of like showing a positive counterexample, but it's not her way of writing herself into Russian society, not even the court society. So she mostly writes very positively about Russian society, with one and herself as an onlooker, with one interesting exception, and that is when she writes about an incident, or she writes about her being part of a Protestant female society in Russia, in St. Petersburg. She describes that she joined this female society and that they gathered for services twice every Sabbath, for prayers. I think I have and that during the flood in 1924, a lot of Bibles and books belonging to the society, to the Protestant society, were destroyed. And so she kind of like organized a kind of fundraising and bought basically Bibles that they could distribute. And she even describes that through a connection of a matron of the Empress's children, she had even a way into the court or the palace, and she distributed Bibles there. And she also did that among St. Petersburg noble society. But then the Russian Orthodox bishop halted that this distribution of Bibles because he saw it as dangerous. And she writes, his religion was in danger, and so he sent a petition to the emperor that all who were found distributing Bibles and tracts should be punished severely. So many were taken and imprisoned, and 2 devoted young men were banished. So not everything that she did was so, blended so smoothly into Russian society. But here is the only, the only moment where she really talks about it. And it's very unclear when this happened. She doesn't give us a real date, but people think it was around 1826. The Russian Orthodox Church had always had a superior position within the Russian Empire already since 1721. And despite the diversity of religious beliefs among the population of the vast territory, and so the autocratic monarch was officially the Orthodox Church's supreme defender. And while other confessions were not always strictly forbidden, the Russian Church and state saw what they falsely identified as foreign confessions as a consistent threat to public order and their political security, and thus were extremely wary of any efforts of foreign clergy or laity to convert Russian citizens into their beliefs. And what further heightened the tensions, especially around the time that Nancy Prince was in Russia, was that political movements tried to challenge the empire, and had and these movements had a religious component as well. So there were different groups like Pan-Turkism or Pan-Islamism, and other kind of minority nationalisms and so forth. And so at that time, or throughout those decades, the Russian Empire was very, the church and the court was very wary of such, initiatives. And while American Protestantism might not have explicitly promoted a political center or something like that, but it was in the eye of the authorities, surely connected to a foreign country, which is the US. Nancy Prince describes this episode, but again, she quickly moves away from it and seems to be very unfazed by all of the ongoings, and that speaks, I think, to her luck, but also to her good connections and friendships with members of the court. But I cannot fully explain it. Maybe it was also a coincidence that it didn't harm her more. But I do think that the events might have, again, affirmed her self-identification as an American citizen and her belonging to the US. And although we do not know when all of this happened, we know it happened way before she left Russia. So she left Russia in 1833 for health reasons. So if we think that these occurrences were at 1826, so it was still, quite a while before she left. I want to emphasize again that in her narrative, Russia has this significant position as a land free from racial prejudice. And although she doesn't talk about that, I'm very sure that Nancy Prince was also aware of Russian official position towards slavery and the enslavement of people from continental Africa. As you probably know better than me, Russia had abolished slavery already under Peter the Great, and especially in around 1818, the Russian, the Tsarist authorities had an internationally very visible anti-slavery position. So they were there were propositions on the table that suggested that slavery should be forbidden, and also slave shipping should be forbidden in the international waters. And although these Russian propositions were not taken up, I'm sure they were still part of the cultural memory, and were for sure part of Nancy Prince's interest in Russia. And so I do think that this background can explain better why Nancy Prince talked so positively, or described her time in Russia so positively, because her narrative as a whole wants to make a point that US American chattel slavery is wrong, that it is, and that there is a possibility of a society that can do without this kind of like slavery, but in general without anti-Black racism. Yeah, I want to stop my presentation here. And I'm very curious for your comments and the question later on. Thank you so much for listening.
Great. Thank you very much, Katharina. That was really interesting, and quite a change of pace from, well, we have a lot of talks that are a change of pace, so I don't want to say from our usual fare, because who knows what our usual fare is, but this was certainly interesting. I was really surprised at many of the things that you said. Our собеседник is Anne Lounsbury, so Anne, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. First of all, Katharina, thank you so much for introducing me to this text, because to my shame, I did not know it. And it's truly extraordinary, and I learned a lot. My remarks will be very brief, because I think people are going to have things to say. I would start just by noting that this text can be contextualized in such different ways, all of them potentially really interesting. I mean, first of all, there's the US antebellum period and what it tells us about, you know, a Black woman's possibilities. It's clear that Prince is using Russia as a foil to comment on American racism when she says, quote, "It is well known that in Petersburg, the color of one's skin does not prohibit any place or prohibit from any place or station that one might be capable of occupying." I'm quite sure that's not true. And it's also really interesting that that Prince, like many other Black American writers in the 19th century, she nonetheless identifies Russia as a very useful rhetorical tool, right? I mean, Russia was very useful to 19th century Black Americans who were trying to get white Americans to think about what it means to, you know, to have a huge portion of your population be unfree. And what was so interesting to them, obviously, about the Russian case was that it was white people who were not free. So she's certainly not alone in doing that. It's also interesting how she's reproducing Russia's own self-mythologization as a sort of kinder, gentler empire, right? It's almost like she has talking points. But again, I think it's because Russia's self-mythologization in that way tends to be a useful one for Black Americans, right? Who are, or for abolitionists, people who are writing about slavery in the 19th century. It's also still on the American side of the contextualization. It's fascinating to see how she uses some of the narrative strategies of slave narratives, for example, just the written by herself, right, where these Black American writers were obligated in these extremely oppressive ways to use writing to establish their humanity, right? Their status as human beings was kind of bolstered by the act of writing, by being literate. And that's where the quote "written by herself" comes in. But as you point out, she's using all these other strategies as well, related to particularly, it sounds like, women's travel writing, with this emphasis on mobility and agency. Then to move to the Russian imperial context, what to me is is most fascinating here is what we can learn and what we cannot learn about the, quote, Arapi, right? The sort of court Moors or court blackamoors, very much in quotation marks, who were present in Russian imperial court. And, you know, as you know, there's this crucial distinction between Arab with a P and Arab with a B. But what is so interesting to me about the Arab with the P is that this category can be used either to emphasize or to obfuscate a person's blackness, right? I mean, and if you look at Dal, the dictionary, Dal says that, well, an Arab with a P is a должность. It's a job that you could have at court, and you didn't have to be black, right? Fact is, it looks like they were pretty much all black, right? And to me, what's so interesting here is the overlap of a certain kind of exoticized blackness and decorativeness, right? They were decoration. And that when Nancy Prince writes about it, she does not write about it in that way, obviously, right? She is writing about them as people who have responsible positions, fancy clothes, and a clearly defined role. So that difference was very interesting to me. Yeah, I mean, the last thing I would say in looking at her narrative are my questions about what she decides to leave out, right? Because she makes this set of decisions about what to omit. And typically when we're looking at Black women's writing, especially from this period, the omissions are often forced, right? They're not allowed to write about certain things. They can't write, for example, about the sexual violence that they suffered. So you know, these circumlocutions and elisions are present in the text, and that's what scholars like Saidiya Hartman, they developed this technique called critical fabulation to try to fill in these gaps. So I would be interested to hear what you think about these gaps, which were very striking to me. Like, why not say more about her husband? All these things. So, okay, thank you so much. I really learned a lot.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. Katharina, do you want to respond to Anne's comments first before we open the floor?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for bringing up the issue with the word, or with the job title, Arab. I learned a lot from you, and I think you're absolutely right that she does not I don't know, admit or strategically misrepresents what Arabs were, or leaves out this aspect of decoration and being decorative, which is not the full humanity, as you put it so nicely, right? She wants to write herself as a full citizen. I would even say not just a human. And this decorativeness, this aspect does not fit into her political program, I would say. So I do think this is also an omission that she makes, probably very strategically. And that's in general something that I want to make strong in my reading, is that her omissions are mostly strategical. I do think she also leaves out stuff that she cannot say because of the time's conventions. Of course, she prints her book herself, so she finds the funding herself, but still she needs to have a printer. And she also wants to sell her book, so she cannot write anything that would be really scandalous. So even when she writes about her sister being coerced into sex work, she does not really go into the the maybe scandalous details of that, and she presents her sister as a really sad victim. And we also don't know what happened to her in the time when she was serving other families. She describes some of the violence that she experienced, but again, it's not very detailed. It's very selective. So I think there are some aspects of because you mentioned sexual violence in Saidiya Hartman, and I do think that there are some omissions for these kind of reasons, but I think most of the omissions she really does for strategical purposes and to make her look better. And if it's really true that Nero Prince was her husband, this Nero Prince who was a very powerful man and who was connected to rather powerful men in the Black community of Boston, then I can only read it as a strategic omission to emphasize her, her self-sufficiency, her agency, and really in every episode that she describes, she comes out as a very strong woman and person. Even if she writes about these the flooding of St. Petersburg, there was a sinkhole right in front of her door and she falls into it, but she gets out by herself without any help because just of her will and her strength, which is probably not true, who knows. But yeah, I think it's more a narrative strategy. Yeah. And that makes it also really special, I think, as a form of Black writing, early Black writing.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Really interesting. Questions from the floor. I think you need to, how does it work? Raise your hand and then you become unmuted and then you unmute or something. Christy Monet.
Hi, Katharina. Thank you so much for this talk. I just recently taught this to my undergraduates in our course, and it was fascinating. And one of the things that stuck with me as I was teaching it was exactly this, and I guess maybe a little bit to follow up on Anne's question as well about these omissions. The omission specifically about Nero Prince is very interesting, but to me, I guess the question I have for you is as an American Studies scholar from that side that I'm less familiar with, could the omission also be not only sort of narrative strategy, but also a sort of political necessity, given that Nero Prince seemed to have been elected the lodge, the Grand Lodge leader of the Prince Hall Masons in 1808, but then it says he sailed from the US to Russia in 1810, which is a very short time for someone to serve as a lodge Grand Master. And so I'm wondering if you have any insight as to sort of how maybe politically dangerous it may have been to be involved in such a unprecedented Black Freemasons lodge that agitated for civil voting rights, social equality, and all of these things, and whether or not that had any bearing on both the decision to leave for Russia, where Freemasons were also very active, but banned, obviously, by 1822, right before they went. Yeah, and whether that had any bearing on sort of Nancy Prince's, just like her decision not to write about him specifically, if there had been some kind of sort of political danger or controversy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's very possible that it was both. I really don't know why Nero Prince decided just 2 years after the fact that to leave for Russia. I know he was married before. It seems he only came back to the US to find another wife. I'm not sure if it's true, but we could construe this, or we could read that into the short time that he spent in the US. yeah, to be frank, I really don't know how dangerous it was at that time, or if there was some direct targeting of Nero Prince or the community that he was part of. Nancy Prince wouldn't write about it. The reason why I emphasized the selectiveness that supports her agency and her the idea that she was very self-sufficient is because it's not only there that she meets the strong man in her life, right? It's kind of like a general, or not even just strong man, but she's very selective in telling us who helped her. She mentions also some other political allies like Lucrezia Mott, for example, but again, she mentions her only very briefly, and she doesn't really go into into these people, and so I read it more as a general strategy. But that doesn't mean that the other reason is not true as well. Yeah, sorry for this kind of like half perfect answer.
Thank you. More questions, comments? Who's raised their hand there? Emily, Emily Wang.
Hey, thank you so much for this talk. This was amazing. I learned a lot, and it was a really thoughtful discussion. I have a question that is related to my own interest, but maybe it'll be of interest to others as well. When I read this, I was surprised by another omission, the fact that she doesn't talk about the Ganabal family or about Pushkin, because she talks about the Decembrists and she's in St. Petersburg at the same time. Pushkin also famously wrote about the flood, although of course the Bronze Horseman wasn't published until after his death. What do you make of the fact that she doesn't talk about the most famous family of Afro-Russians, that is like Abraham Ganabal and his descendants? Oh, really? Okay. Okay. Well, then that would explain it. Okay.
There's a conversation going on in the chat. I don't know.
I see that one. Yeah, that would also be my only explanation, that she probably heard of Pushkin, but she probably never met him or had no closer knowledge of him. Yeah.
Can let me ask a question really quick. Does from what the quotations that you were showing us, the actual pages from the book, I get the impression that the part that talks about Russia is the first 30 pages or something like that, 35 pages. Is it that short, her account, or is it scattered in different places in the book?
Her account is in general short. It's a short book.
Okay.
And I would say she talks about Russia in about, I don't know, 15, 20 pages. But it's in general, it's a very short book, and yeah, and it spans her whole, basically her whole life.
Right. So she's not gonna be able to go into much detail on. She has to make some very big choices to just cover 9 years in 20 pages, right?
Yeah, and I think by the choices that she makes and that she describes something so in such great detail and then leaves out years and years, I think that means something to me. Yeah. Because if she wanted to give a more even, if it wasn't a political decision or a narrative strategy, she would choose a more even distribution of the years, and also, yeah, I was always like, with the first few times I read it, I was like, why is she giving us all the details of how the Empress, greets visitors and stuff like that? I do think there is a really an interesting selection process going on.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Nadezhda Kitsenko.
Hi. Thank you. This was a wonderful talk, and a собеседник also. And I have a question from the perspective of someone who teaches Russian history to African American students. And they invariably respond incredibly well to any kinds of narratives where it's African Americans in the Russian Empire, their perspectives and so on. But they also respond very well to a narrative of a Swedish woman, Birgitta Schwarzenfeld, she has like 5 last names because she was married 5 times. So the idea that someone who is a white person who is taken captive and is in the Russian Empire and in Central Asia. But the interesting thing to me is both Nancy Prince and Birgitta talk about their needlework and their skills with needlework as being key to their survival in the new environment and emphasizing their technical skills. And I was just wondering if you had anything to say about that. I've only come across this in the context of these 2 memoirs. And I'm wondering to what extent this is a practical reality, to what extent this is a trope. So that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I haven't put too much thought into that, to be honest, because I read Prince's description of her profession from 2 directions. So on the one hand side, she makes very clear that she made a decision to learn something practical. And she even says that, right? I made the decision to learn a craft. And then I made the decision to leave my country. And so it's more, and there at that point, she doesn't go into detail what she learned. She just said, I learned something that is useful, and then I left. And then when she talks about her business in Russia, to me, in my perspective, I don't know, maybe you read it differently, but I read it more as I provided something good, but the point is that the Russian court society appreciated that. And they appreciated me for my skills, but and didn't look down on me because I'm Black or, so I read it more as this opportunity to show how a more just society could react, and less about what she actually provided. I mean, of course, she mentions, it was in the best French and English style. But yeah, maybe you have a different view. I just approached it from these 2 points.
Eugene Clay.
Thanks for this really interesting talk. I put in the chat a reference that may be of interest to you. It's the file on the death of Nero Prince in the Russian State Historical Archive. And it mentions specifically, I think that Nancy Prince had left before he died. She mentions that, I think, but apparently there's some kind of correspondence, or maybe she left instructions because she asked to have him to have the funeral service or a memorial service. It's not, it's at Piet is but that he be have this memorial service in the English church. And so there is some material about her wishes in the Russian State Historical Archive that might be of interest to you. And of course, there's been a lot of scholarship on these Black servants, that I guess might be of interest to you. I mean, in your broader work. But anyway, that particular. I was wondering too if you had seen, this is a much later memoir, and it's a kind of different one, but it's Nicholas Said, who's he's actually ends up as he's captured by slave raiders in Africa, he's sold, he ends up in the Ottoman Empire, and he's given to a Russian nobleman who then and then he serves as a kind of an example of this. I think it's an imitation of the courts, but then he ends up coming to the United States and serves in the Union Army writes his memoir. It may be beyond your. I mean, of course, it's quite the opposite. He's coming to the United States, but he writes about his his conversion to Orthodox Christianity. He's Muslim. He converts to Orthodox Christianity. Then, when he comes to the United States, he becomes a Swedenborgian. But at any rate, it is a kind of. I think his experience in Russia and in this the Trubetskoy family where he's serves for a number of years is pretty interesting. So those are a couple of references. I hope that's
Thank
helpful.
you so much. I really appreciate it. I did not know about this record of Nancy Prince leaving instructions for the funeral. That's so super interesting. And also thank you for reminding me of Nicholas Said. I think somebody just wrote a book about him and it's on my my reading list, but I haven't gotten to it, but it definitely sounds very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Mina Magda, do you have your hand up? Mina?
Yeah, I couldn't unmute myself to say yes.
Okay.
So I came in late, so forgive me if this was, discussed in that time that I missed, but I just wanted to know about reception and circulation. When Pushkin came up, I thought immediately about how he was taken up by American abolitionists, in the 1840s as a sort of shining beacon of what the free Negro could be. And so I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily how Nancy Prince's work would be taken up, but I'm just curious as to how it was.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm not entirely sure if I can give a satisfying answer. I couldn't find many references to her. I know she gave, when she came back from Russia, she again, she fell into poverty when her husband died, or near poverty. And that was also a reason why she wrote her story down and sold it. She explains that also in length in the beginning of her memoir, which of course is on the one hand side a strategy to say, like, I'm not vain, but also I do believe that she had to struggle to support herself. So what she did, she started with talking about her Russian experiences and started also taking part in abolitionist events, but also the events by the women's movement. So I wanted to mention that, but then I forgot in the end that she was actually one of the first people who and that's documented, talked about the special plight of Black women, and particularly Black enslaved women, of course, in front of the emerging women's movement. And so there are places, or there are references to her, but I haven't read anybody who really takes up her points. It's more a curiosity that she was that she lived in Russia for a while and brought this experience. And she's also mentioned as a free Black woman fighting for abolition. But long story short, I don't think she was very much. She was probably read, but there is not much references in other people's writing to her, other than these curious points. But maybe somebody could also prove me wrong. It's not that I can say that I read everything from this period. And she was very well connected in the Boston circles, that's for sure.
You said her first volume was self-published, right? In 1850.
All of them. Yeah.
So do you know how many copies there were of these?
Oof, I wrote that down somewhere, but I don't know it from the top of my head.
I mean, is it 100, 50, 10?
No, I think it was more. I think it was more. Yeah. but yeah, still a self-published book.
Mhm.
But yeah, she published it 3 times by herself, and she also edited quite a bit. So the version that I'm referring to is already the last version, and the more she edited, the more her belonging to the US and her claims to US citizenship come through. I mean, they're always there, but she changes and tweaks the wording, the language. Yeah, in the last version, it's the clearest, I would say.
Mhm.
Which also speaks to her life as a, that she got further and further into abolitionism and yeah, the struggle for Black liberation.
Okay. Are there other questions from the floor at this moment? I have a question I wanted to ask. It occurs to me that in the 1820s, when she first arrived in 1824, something like that, there were a few years in which there were actually 2 empresses, right? The older Maria Fyodorovna, Nicholas's mother, was still around. Well, I guess she was there, right, in the descent. So she was there when there, yeah. It would have been 3 empresses, right? The the older empress, the grandmother empress, right, and Alexander's wife, and then she's there when Alexander dies, right? And then because she sees in December. So when she talks about empresses, which empress is she talking about?
So she talks about the first empress when she's greeted and welcomed, but then it's not clear. Sometimes she gives very detailed dates, as I've shown, even days, not just years, but then sometimes she just doesn't. So we really don't know when this whole thing with the Bibles happened. And that was also the time when she had an in with some of the matrons or with one of the matrons of the children. The empress's children or somebody's children in the court, and yeah, so she doesn't mention. But she must have met both of them for sure, or all 3 of them. If you
right. I don't know if the older one was an actively part of the court in these years. She would have been rather older, or I really don't know, but it's interesting to think about. It seems like there would be some record from some other source of this problem with the Bibles, from some other something. That seems like it might have been pretty important.
Yeah, although what I got from Russian studies scholars who work with archival materials and stuff like that, it's not entirely clear when it happened, because it happened several times, or it happened this kind of like fight with missionaries or missionary activities, because they were not full-blown missionaries, but yeah, this kind of like battle between the bishop and other religious leaders was not a one-time occurrence. So but people think that it happened in 1826.
I have another question. I'll keep going if no one raises their hand or interrupts. You said that she says in her diary that the language that the people speak is a mixture of Slavonic or Sclavonian or something and Polish. Do you have any idea what that means, or does somebody else have an idea of what that means?
Yeah, some of her descriptions are very very uninformed, I would say.
Well, it might be that some of the people that were working around spoke some kind of a peasant dialect that was Ukrainian or associated with Ukrainian, so they called it Polish, or who knows?
Maybe, who knows? Yeah.
Just to say they speak differently than we do,
Yeah.
Eugene and Ludmila, I don't know who's first. Maybe Ludmila, since she hasn't spoken yet. Can you unmute Ludmila? Almost. There you
Hello?
go.
Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. I couldn't unmute at first. I actually have a question about whether you know, Katharina, if there are other domestics or servants who have written accounts of coming to Russia, whether they're African American or otherwise, from this time period, because I had actually read this in my research on the Decembrists, and I thought it was really interesting, and I was trying to track down more, and I wasn't coming up with much of anything.
Mhm.
Thank you.
No, it's the only account that I know of. I mean, my focus is also yeah, on Americans or people from the US. So I couldn't find any. But that doesn't mean that there are not other nationalities or
Right, because there was one of the ambassadors who came from, I think it was the Charleston area in South Carolina, who was American ambassador to Russia during the Decembrist revolt. And I've been trying to track down things related to him. And I'm assuming he brought an entourage with him, you know, of servants, but I haven't come up with anything. So I was curious to see whether you, thank you. It was great. It's been a great, really interesting talk, and собеседник as well. Thank you.
Eugene?
So I was just going to say that this is, I mean, it sounds like the Russian Bible Society, which was founded in 1813 and closed in 1826. So, you know, that was a major effort under Alexander I. In part, you know, it was a response to Russian victory over Napoleon. So the Russian Bible Society gets established in 1813 and begins translating the Bible into a variety of languages, including Russian, and distributing those Bibles. And that effort is by the time of Nicholas, it's considered to be dangerous, and it's repressed. So that the Bible Society is closed. But that's probably, you know.
May I ask you, because you're definitely the more expert in that, but this Bible Society was this kind of like cross-denomination effort, right?
Right.
Or am I wrong? It was
That's
not
right.
a purely Protestant society.
No, but I mean, it's kind of, yes, it's a kind of pietistic enterprise that was able, and Alexander the First was very interested in this kind of pietistic spirituality that you know it also connected with Freemasonry, and there's a lot, you know, the Freemasons were they were also closed, right? The Freemason in the 1820s. So there, yes, you're absolutely right. The Russian Bible Society was a non-denominational, was an effort to try to create a you know, to do something that Christians could generally agree on, having these Bible translations, and for a time it was quite successful.
Yeah, the reason why I thought it might not have been, maybe it was overlapping in a way, but why I thought it's not exactly the Bible Society is because she talked about a Protestant group. So that's why I thought maybe it was a different one, or maybe it overlapped. I don't know, but I definitely should look more into this. And thanks for the info.
So my colleague Stephen Batalden wrote a book on Bible translations that came out, I think, with Cambridge. So I can put that in the chat for you if you.
Much.
Excellent. Another question from Christy.
Oh, yes. So yeah, this is just a really quick one. I was just curious, is this part of a larger research project? or could you tell, is there anything you'd tell us about the larger research project?
Yeah, it's supposed to be my habilitation. In Europe, we still have to do this kind of like what you call second book, but it's a little bit more than a second book. Yeah, so it's a diachronic kind of like project that looks into Russian-American relations, but not official state relations necessarily, but more from marginalized positions. So I'm really interested in Black Americans who either write about Russia or go to Russia in the 19th century. And Nancy Prince is definitely one of the earliest example that I could find. And how these kind of like myths of Russia kind of like, manifested in Black thought and what kind of like real life experiences are behind these. So that's one of the angles, but I'm also interested in Alaska and the Russian colonial efforts in Alaska and how it especially influenced Native societies, Alaska Native societies, and religious beliefs and so forth. So this kind of like or what we could call peripheral encounters that are not so much focused in usually when we talk about transnational relations, but that kind of like I don't know, can be traced till today, I think, in a lot of ways. So that's what I'm trying to do. But I started this project a while ago, and then I never came to really work on it because of my job in American studies. So I spent most of my time teaching American studies and cultural studies. But yeah, I love this project, and I'm so grateful for all of your input. That inspired me a lot to take it up again and do more.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I don't see any hands right now. I have another question, which is, you mentioned that she may have read the work of Frederick Douglass, which was published before hers. I'm wondering if you have any other ideas of what models she might have had. Do we know anything about her reading in general?
So she didn't explicitly say what she was reading, but let me just take out my notes. Then because I have terrible memory. But she definitely references people's notions. So, and because she was in Boston and really well connected to abolitionists and feminist abolitionists, we can speculate of where those notions came from. And let me just quickly look at my draft, at my notes. 1 second. So Delaney, for example, the Black abolitionist Delaney would be one of the people that she that her language is very close to. He was he published in the Condition, and he when he talks about the U.S. And tries to formulate this kind of like citizen belonging from a Black position. She sounds very much like him. And he was a big, a very well-known speaker and publisher at the time when she was in Boston. So yeah, that's one of the people. Frederick Douglass, I already mentioned. These are the two that come to my mind right now.
Okay.
But it's
Thank
also interesting that she doesn't mention them by name.
Right.
And I think that's her strategy of like making herself, like
Right.
elevating herself.
Taking the men out. Yeah. Are there any other questions? If not, thank you very much for coming to share your work with us. And thank you, Anne, for your comments. This was really quite interesting. And thank you also, Anne, for the link to the book, which I'm sure many of us will be ripping through the pages about Russia very shortly. See what she says about Decembrist blood and so on. Thank you. That was really interesting. And goodbye to everyone until next September.
Thank you
So
so much. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
Happy end of academic year to everyone.